Complex numbers and complex solutions. What is the solution set of x squared plus 9 equals 0? So the first thing, it's basically just asking you to solve it. So I need to get my x by itself. So let me come over here and write it down so I can work with it. So to get the x by itself, you have to first of all get rid of the adding 9. So the opposite of adding 9 is subtracting 9. So I'm going to subtract 9 from both sides. Bring down the x squared, opposites cancel, 0 minus 9 is negative 9. To get rid of a square, you do the opposite, you square root. But when you do the other side, when you take the square root of a constant, you have to do plus or minus. So opposites cancel. So x equals plus or minus. Now here's the thing, this is called an imaginary number whenever you have a negative under a square root. So the imaginary, you take out the negative, just scratch it out. You take it out by calling it the letter I. And I left some space here because any numerical part of your imaginary component comes first. And the square root of 9 is 3. So we're going to have two answers for this. We're going to have x equals 3i and x equals negative 3i. Okay, the next one, I am going to not have enough space, I don't believe, but we'll see. Sorry about that. Okay, we have to, because you have a square term in front of x and there's no, 2 times 2 is 4, there's no factors of 4 that when you add them equal 3, you are going to be forced to use the quadratic formula on this. So the quadratic formula, let me come out here and write it. It's negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So I'm going to use that for each, well, for this one. I'm not going to use it for the other two. You'll see why in a moment. Okay, so don't think of this as negative b because some students mistakenly think that that first number has to be a negative. Think of this as meaning the opposite of b. So the opposite of b. So the opposite of positive 3 is negative 3. Then I have plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Okay, so I'm going to figure underneath the radical first. So that's negative 3, sorry, I don't know why I wrote that. Negative 3 plus or minus the square root, okay, 3 squared. 3 times 3 is 9 minus 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 2 is 16. All over 4. So that's negative 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 15. I'm sorry, that's not a 15. I don't know what I'm thinking. It's 16. Oh, I already have 16 down there. Negative 7. Sorry, can't subtract today. Over 4. Okay, I'm going to come out here, kind of infringe on this one maybe a little bit. Here's the thing. We have negative 3 plus or minus, you got to split these up with the denominator, plus or minus square root of negative 7 over 4, because whenever you write a complex number, you have to have the real component and then the imaginary component, and they have to be split apart. Now there's a 1 under here, and that's important because that gives me negative 3/4 plus or minus 1/4. And then because of the negative, you have an imaginary component, and then square root of 7 cannot be simplified. So that's how you write that. Now I'm going to split it up so that I have my two separate answers. So negative 3/4 plus 1/4 I square root of 7, and negative 3/4 minus 1/4 I the square root of 7. Those are the two answers for that problem. Okay, coming out here to do the next one. Sorry, I kind of went over my space there. Whenever you have a polynomial with 4 terms, you take the first two and put parentheses around them, and I can factor or take out, they have 2 x's in common, so I can take out an x squared. So I have 3 x's, but I took 2 out, so that's 1 left over. Then I have a negative 2 and 2 x's, but I took the 2 x's out, so that's negative 2 left over. You write down the sign after your parentheses, and you don't put parentheses around these, you just look at them, the 4 and the 8, and you say what can I divide those by. It's got to be the biggest number you can divide them by, so that would be 4 in this case. So that gives me what I have in the parentheses, and then what's not in the parentheses has to go together, x squared plus 4. Okay, if you have parentheses that don't have any exponents in it, you can just take the opposite of the number in there. So the opposite of negative 2 is positive 2. Now this one you do have to solve. So I'm going to come out to the side and set that equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides. So x squared equals negative 4. Take plus or minus the square root. Opposites cancel. So x equals, okay, plus or minus, the square root of 4 is 2, and because of the negative, you've got an imaginary component. So I've got a positive 2i and a negative 2i, and that is the answer to this function up here. Okay, the next one, remember zeros is another name for solution, so we're just going to do the exact same thing with this, kind of. You'll see what I mean by kind of in a minute. X to the 4th minus 4x cubed minus 9x squared plus 36x. Okay, the first thing I notice right away is I have an x in each term, so I'm going to take an x out of each term because I have to factor common factors first. So I have 4x's, I took 1 out, that's 3 left, minus sign. A negative 4 and 3 x's, but I took an x out, so that's a negative 4 and 2 x's. I have a negative 9 and 2 x's, but I took an x out, so that's a negative 9 and 1 x. And I have a positive 36 and an x, but I took the x out, so that's a positive 36. Now, anytime you have taken an x out, 0 is automatically one of your answers. Okay, so now, that meant that 0 was one of my answers, so now I take this and I factor it like the previous problem. So x cubed minus 4x squared minus 9x plus 36. I group the first two. I could take 2 x's out of that. So that leaves me x minus, and then I have a negative 4 and 2 x's. I took the 2 x's out, so that's a minus 4 there. You bring down the sign after your parentheses, and you look at these and see what the biggest number is that you can divide them both by, and that would be 9. So the x minus 4 goes in parentheses, and then what wasn't in parentheses, they have to go together. Okay, this first set of parentheses doesn't have exponents. And remember when I said there are no exponents, you do the opposite of the number that's inside. So the opposite of negative 4 is positive 4. This one I have to actually work with a little bit more. You set it equal to 0. I'm going to add 9 to both sides. So x squared, opposites cancel, equals 9. I am going to take the plus or minus square root, so x squared equals plus or minus the square root of 9. Opposites cancel, x equals plus or minus the square root of 9 is 3. So when I split that up, that gives me a positive 3 and a negative 3. So that is my 4 zeros, 4 solutions, 4 roots to each of to that equation that I had previously, to this equation.